and directly in line with the Seattle Freeway's Ship Canal Bridge, which was completed in 1962. The freeway bridge lay idle while construction continued on the freeway itself, and during Century 21, the empty high bridge was briefly and somewhat bizarrely considered as a parking lot for World's Fair visitors. Returning to the David Denny's, their claim, seen here from Queen Anne, had developed to this by 1893, the year that, however, ruined many, including David and Louisa. They lost their railroad, and here on the right, their mansion, which was eventually taken from them when the city's banks, including David's brother Arthur's bank, the Dexter Horton, demanded payment on overdue loans. But the crash year, 1893, was also the year the Great Northern arrived. At last, Seattle became the terminus for a transcontinental railroad, although by then the city's old adversary, the Northern Pacific, was giving it equal service with Tacoma. The new railroad arrived without much fanfare. The Madison Street trolley was decorated for the occasion, and an industrial exhibit was briefly opened on Pioneer Square. 11 years later, in 1904, the world's then largest steamers, the Great Northern's Dakota and Minnesota, arrived at the railroad's Smith Cove docks, and thereby linked the GN's transcontinental rails with its trans-Pacific steam to speed the perishable but lucrative silk through Seattle to the East Coast mills. Smith Cove was named for Henry Smith, perhaps the noblest of Seattle's early settlers. The poet, botanist, linguist, and surgeon settled at Inner Bay in 1853 and died there in 1915 at the age of 85. Here in the late 1880s, we see beyond the Smith home the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Trestle at Smith Cove entering Inner Bay. At the time of Smith's death, the newly formed Port of Seattle was filling in the tide flats of his cove and building Piers 90 and 91, the longest earth-filled piers in the world. The 1893 economic crash was made harder off Skid Road in 1894 by a local ordinance revoking the license of any establishment that both employed women and sold liquor. Box House Bordello theaters like the Lyric at Occidental in Maine were ruined temporarily. Denny Hall was dedicated in 1895, the first structure on the university's new North Campus, and despite some Philistines' attempts to raze it during that architecturally dismal decade, the 1950s, the French chateau-style Denny Hall survives, although the bell, which was originally moved from the old campus to its belfry, has been chained and replaced with electronic chimes. The 1890s was the decade of the bicycle, and beginning in 1896, the Queen City Good Roads Club helped the city's engineers build a system of bike trails around Lake Union and on to Lake Washington. Chief Seattle's daughter, whom Catherine Maynard named Princess Angeline, died in 1896. For years, she lived in a waterfront shack near where now the Pike Street hill climb descends from the public market to the aquarium. Angeline was given a sentimental burial at Lakeview Cemetery. Placed in a canoe-shaped casket with a paddle resting on the stern, she was buried beneath a rough-hewn monument, and nearby her patron Henry Yesler Stone. Yesler had died 4 years earlier. The systematic reclamation of the tide flats south of Pioneer Square began in 1896, and the following year Moritz Thompson built his Centennial Mill on the newly made land near the waterfront foot of what is now Royal Brome Way. Also in 1897, Donald Frederick and Nels Nelson moved their then 8-year-old furniture store into the Rialto building, where there was room enough to develop one of Seattle's first department stores. However, the portentous event of 1897 was the arrival of the steamer Portland from Alaska with what the local dailies headlined its ton of gold. The stampede to the north began instantly, with Seattle firms managing most of the outfitting and transportation to the Klondike goldfields. Seattle's waterfront, still a rough assemblage of timber quays beneath which the tide splashed, was a strip of sustained excitement as ships, crowded with novice miners and their supplies, left for the north to later return, hopefully, but very rarely, rich. The rush north was given added life in 1898 when gold was discovered on the shores of Nome, Alaska. Here at the foot of Spring Street on June 3, 1901, the steamer Humboldt takes on its 800 tons of cargo and 320 passengers, including 35 members of a theater company booked for Nome's biggest theater, the Standard. The Humboldt, like the passengers aboard the SS Ohio, would too often have to sit days in the ice of the Bering Sea, waiting for it to loosen and let them through to Nome. The Pioneer Square totem was a prize stolen from the gold rush when a group of local businessmen, curiously named the Goodwill Committee, was sent north by the Chamber of Commerce to promote Seattle's courtship with the North. They returned to Seattle with the totem. They stopped to cut down without asking and hauled away from Tongass Island. They were later fined. At the totem's October 19, 1899 dedication, the wrought iron arches erected for yet another celebration was still a work in progress on Pioneer Square. The iron arches are seen completed here and decorated for the November 6th welcome home of the Washington Volunteers who served in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. Shipped back aboard the SS Queen, the volunteers were followed into Elliott Bay by an entourage of 18 steamers. Soon thereafter, City Park atop Capitol Hill was renamed for the volunteers. A rock at the park's southern entrance commemorates that change. Also in 1899, the first duplex along Fort Lawton's Officers' Row was completed. Ye Old Curiosity Shop was opened on the waterfront. The steamer Idaho was propped on piles at the foot of Jackson Street and converted into the Wayside Mission, a hospital for the down and out. Arthur Denny died at the age of 77 in 1899, and Hing Wo opened his laundry on Fifth Avenue, now the site of the King County Administration Building. At the time, Hing Wo's was one of 25 Chinese hand laundries in a community of nearly 90,000. In 1900, the first automobile came to town. Not this one, but one like it. It too was electric. The steamer City of Seattle returned from the north, carrying nearly 3 tons of gold. $22 million worth of dust and bullion passed through the Seattle Assay Office in 1900. Also in 1900, the city purchased Woodland Park on Finney Ridge from the Finney family, whose private trolley ran up Fremont Avenue to the park's granite gate off 50th Avenue. Posted park rules included warnings against spitting, swearing, gambling, threats that stray dogs would be shot, and a request that the last one to leave turn off the water. The 1901 decision to build the new federal building at 3rd and Union was a victory for the Uptown Boys, who promoted the move of the city's commercial center to the north. Meet Me at the Steps was for many years a familiar proposal, referring to the post office's wide stairway on 3rd. Also in 1901, ex-Washington Governor Eugene Semple began his quixotic but failed attempt to cut a canal through Beacon Hill to Lake Washington. Semple did manage to remove by trestle some of Beacon Hill, sluicing and then spreading it over a few acres of tide lands, which in 1901 were still regularly flooded with the waters of Elliott Bay. This view looks west from Beacon Hill along the line of the Spokane Street Viaduct, with a glimpse only of the Spokane Street corridor, now for comparison. In 1918, Sears was still bordered by this wetland. Some other parts of the city's industrial district, south of Pioneer Square, were not filled until the 1930s. Turn-of-the-century changes on the central waterfront involved a realignment of its piers from this stubby and jumbled collection to the uniform alignment of the new, in 1901, Northern Pacific Piers 3, 4, and 5. That's now Piers 54 through 56. After Coleman Dock, the Northern Pacific's Pier 3 was the principal Seattle port for the Mosquito fleet of small-sized steamers that, before the development of the culture of motor cars, were the best and often only sensible way of traveling between the mostly east side communities on Puget Sound, or up its tributaries like the Duwamish and Snohomish rivers. Piers 55 and 56, here center and far right, were home to larger ocean-going steamers with ports of call from London to Vladivostok. Now the Central Waterfront has long since turned from work to play, and the noise and confusion across Railroad Avenue's 8 sets of parallel tracks has been reduced to the music of the waterfront trolleys' cars riding their double tracks, sometimes in antiphony, with the occasional busker and, in this instance, a band of non-ninja and yet definitely hip reptiles. On February 21st, 1901, water from Cedar River was first piped into the city's mains. Tested for its purity and bouquet by members of the city council, the new system allowed the city to discontinue drawing its water from the increasingly polluted Lake Washington. The abandoned pump house at Coleman Park was eventually converted into a dressing house for park swimmers. The capacity of the high reservoir at Volunteer Park was supplemented in 1907 with the completion of the park's standpipe, from whose observation deck the prospect north looked out on the park's conservatory and its Olmsted Brothers landscaping, which in the intervening 80-plus years has filled in considerably, standing now nearly as high as the tower. In 1932, the Art Deco Seattle Art Museum was added to the park's attractions. Returning now to 1901, this year Seattle Times publisher Alden Blethyn moved his family into their classical colonial home on Queen Anne Hill's West Highland Drive, view property which was reached on the Queen Anne Avenue counterbalance seen here from Mercer Street in 1902. Beneath the street were, and still are, although now idle, 2 tunnels along which weighted or counterbalanced cars connected to streetcars above help pull them up Queen Anne Avenue and restrain them in their descent of the avenue's steep grade. Trackless trolleys replaced the counterbalance in 1940 as part of the city's system-wide conversion from rails to rubber. In 1902, the view south from West Highland Drive looked over the future site of Seattle Center to a business district then still hidden behind the gentle rise of Denny Hill and its distinguished landmark, the Denny Hotel. Since the construction of the Space Needle for Century 21 in 1962, the view from Queen Anne has been considerably filled out with the modern clutter of a skyline which, with a few exceptions, like Mount Rainier when you can see it, is more conventional than distinguished. Returning to 1902, Broadway High School on Capitol Hill opened this year, the first city school devoted exclusively to grades 9 through 12. The Seattle-Tacoma Interurban began operating this year with a 75-minute express trip between Tacoma and its Seattle depot here on Occidental Avenue just off of Yesler Way. Previously, Mosquito Fleet steamers like the Flyer had a monopoly on the movement of passengers between the ports of Tacoma, here on Commencement Bay in Seattle. In 1902, the university added Science Hall, now Parrington, to Denny Hall, and at last eliminated preparatory courses, devoting itself exclusively to higher education. Here, Parrington Hall, partially hidden behind the fir on the left, has taken its place beside Denny Hall. The Elks Carnival of 1902 was the first of the city's big summertime celebrations and featured 3 parade arches, the highest of which was the classical span built across First Avenue at Columbia Street. The week-long Golden Potlatch Days, which began in 1911, were citywide events sponsored for themselves rather than distinguished visitors or by fraternal conventions. With the Potlatch parades were a daily occasion, including a Parade of All Nations featuring an Afro-American float among many others. The 1913 Potlatch introduced Father's Day to Seattle with a parade of pops dressed in aprons and ball and chain and carrying domestic utensils. The last of the city's monumental street arches spanned 2nd at Marion during the Knights Templars' 1925 Seattle Convention. By then, 2nd Avenue was the city's preferred parade route. Returning to 1903, the streetcar strike of May 27th was a sign of organized labor's growing power in a city which would later earn a reputation as one of the nation's strongest union towns. The Seattle Symphony was established in 1903 under the direction of Harry West. On May 23rd, Theodore Roosevelt made his first visit to Seattle. Leading an entourage of Mosquito Fleet steamers, the great Rough Rider walked off the steamer Spokane at the foot of University Street and paraded through a city packed for the occasion. That evening he was the first guest at the Washington Hotel, the old Denny Hotel, atop Denny Hill. The hotel's lobby was easily the city's most elegant space. A one-block-long counterbalanced railway climbed from the corner of 3rd and Pine to the hotel's front door. Only 4 years later, the Grand Hotel was destroyed, a sacrifice to city engineer Reginald Thompson's promise to dig the city out of its hole. The Denny regrade was the single biggest public work in Seattle's history. It eventually scraped and hosed away the clay and gravel of Denny Hill from 40-plus city blocks. In the last years of the horse, it was claimed that the hill, seen here from Elliott Bay, inhibited the, quote, natural northerly expansion of the city, unquote. Actually, the regraders and North End boomers had the techniques and tools to flatten the pitch of this modest hill into pricey real estate, and it was completed, ironically, in time for the automobile and acres of parking lots. Actually, Denny Hill was a natural resource, adding variety to the city's shape, seen here from First Hill, and a marvelous prospect from which to inspect the bay and city in all directions. This group, posed for their profiles perhaps, looks west towards the bay from the hotel's front balcony. Looking between them, to their left, we can just glimpse the line of 3rd Avenue, rendered here in 1890 before the hotel was constructed on the site by an artist who had the freedom to insert the often shrouded Mount Rainier. And here again in 1903, atop the Washington Hotel's front balcony, when the late afternoon sun throws long shadows across the 3rd Avenue, which was then something of a church row. The same prospect today looks out from the roof of a parking lot. It is perspective still about 40 or 50 feet lower than that from the hotel. Church Row has long since lost its sanctuaries to the temples of commerce. The imposing presence of the Gothic Hotel was best felt from the floor of 3rd Avenue. This view, photographed from near Seneca Street, includes the spire of Plymouth Congregational Church on the far right. Here in 1907, the regrade is approaching the hotel's central tower, while below 3rd Avenue is being wrestled to a grade more convenient, perhaps, for commerce. All this was torn up once more in the late 1980s for the construction of the bus tunnel, which now runs beneath 3rd Avenue from Jackson Street to Pine. The Denny Hill regrade began on 1st Avenue in the mid-1880s to ease the grade for the horse cars approaching Belltown. This cliff along the avenue's eastern side, north of Virginia Street, was a fixture until the regraders began their move east to 2nd Avenue, seen here looking south from Bell Street, before the regrade and hereafter. By 1906, a cliff had been created along the east side of 2nd, south of Virginia. The Moore Theater and the New Washington Hotel were completed by 1908, when the regraders began their attack on the main portion of the hill east of 2nd. There, the excavating created some Wagnerian landscapes and large mannered movement of houses. For instance, this tilting structure, photographed here in early 1910, was soon after dragged west to a position hidden behind the spike or mound on the right. Its new place in front of that mound is revealed in this scene, photographed in October of 1910. And here we also see Denny School at 5th and Battery, with its west wing cutaway, sacrificed to a new cliff along 5th Avenue. This view looks north from the top of that precipice, and upper right shows Denny School minus its west wing. A left turn, 18 years later, looks west from the top of the cliff on 5th and reveals how the original regraded blocks had developed by 1928, or had not developed. The big home that was moved in 1910 still survives in the shadows of the new neighborhood. Aside from the Denny Hotel, the most photographed structure in the history of the regrade was this rooming house at 4th and Lenora. Lowered by jacks and cribbing step by step, it was then remodeled for the new neighborhood without its gabled roof. Behind it we can again see the cliff along 5th, where in 1911 the regrade stopped for 18 years. At its base, the cliff was quite imposing in this setting north from near Lenora Street in late 1910. Looking in the opposite direction, south, or from nearly the same place only 25 years earlier, shows the wagon road that ran north from the city along the line of a Fifth Avenue, which was then still about 20 feet higher than the elevated track which supports today's monorail as it approaches Lenora Street on its run between the Westlake Mall and Seattle Center. The grand neoclassical civic center that was included in Virgil Bogue's 1911 plan for Seattle and proposed for the freshly regraded area was rejected by voters in 1912. Instead, the regrade neighborhood, seen here from the Space Needle in the early 60s, developed into an often depressed and ordinarily undistinguished district of warehouses, apartments, and service industries. Returning now to 1904, the launching of the keel of the battleship Nebraska from Moran's shipyard that year and the subsequent construction of its superstructure was prophetic of the role played by Seattle shipyards during the two world wars. The launch of the Nebraska was the stern Robert Moran's second big splash. The first was his fleet of 12 light draft riverboats built on the tide flats in 1898 for use on the Yukon River. In this view from Beacon Hill, the fleet appears under construction on the tidelands, near where Moritz Thompson built his Centennial Mill 2 years earlier. The boats straddled the present route of Royal Brome Way. Their paddle wheels sat on what is now the Kingdome South parking lot. In 1898, high tides could still reach the shores of Beacon Hill, but by 1914, this part of the tidelands south of Pioneer Square was filled in, and the waterfront was secured where the Skinner and Eddy shipyard, formerly Moran's, waited for the record ship orders that were soon delivered with the First World War. When the layoffs and pay reductions which followed that war inspired a strike at the shipyards, it quickly developed 2 weeks later into the city's 5-day general strike in February 1919. Here at 7th and Union, strikers gather outside the Dreamland Dance Hall, a large pavilion frequently used for labor rallies and lectures. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, many of the remaining open spaces south of Pioneer Square were made domestic by homeless men. The old Skinner and Eddy acres off East Marginal Way were developed into a Hooverville, named for the president under whose watch the Depression began. This community of homeless men survived until torched by the powers that be in the late 30s. When still intact, nearly 1,000 men lived in Hooverville in the shadow of the Smith Tower. It is now the site of the Port of Seattle's container field off East Marginal Way. Rudimentary squatting on Seattle's beaches began in 1865 when the town's first ordinances included a prohibition against Indians camping in town. Later, the natives' use of Ballast Island and the new man-made beaches south of King Street during the Tidelands reclamation continued this tradition. Muckamuck, the spring-fed beach below Denny Hill, was also a popular native camping ground. Note the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Trestle on the left. After the 1893 National Depression, this beach was developed into an elaborate neighborhood of squatters' shacks. This view dates from 1903 or 4. The Alaska Building, Seattle's first steel-girdered skyscraper, was built in 1904 at Cherry and 2nd. It continued the shift of the city's center from the old Pioneer Square to 2nd Avenue, which developed into the city's commercial canyon of glass, terracotta, brick, and granite. Its urbane, grand style was so admired that it was fittingly exaggerated in that perennial vehicle of civic promotion, the postcard. Also in 1904, Alexander Pantages opened his vaudeville house, the Pantages Theater, at 2nd and Seneca. In 1905, the city's new dynamos on the Cedar River began sending the first of Seattle's municipally owned power to the city's first substation on Yesler Way. City Light used its kilowatts to generously promote people power, especially at its Lake Union steam plant, which it added in 1917. Relief came to Railroad Avenue on the city's congested central waterfront in 1905 when trains were diverted through the railroad tunnel beneath the city, which was completed that year, and complemented the following year by the King Street Depot. Much of the new railroad yard created south of King Street on the reclaimed tide flats was eventually chosen as the site for construction of the county's dome stadium, the Kingdome, which, since its opening in 1976, has given sports fans air-conditioned cover in all seasons, hot, cold, winning, and losing, mostly losing. Westlake Avenue was cut through between Pike Street and Lake Union in 1906, creating a new throughway to the north and a promising five-star corner at 4th and Pike. Early proposals for originating a county-wide elevated transit at Westlake Mall were modestly realized when the downtown terminal for Century 21's monorail was sited there in 1962. Colonel Hiram Chittenden's 1906 arrival in Seattle would ultimately lead to the creation and survival of the Port of Seattle and the construction of the Lake Washington Ship Canal. The canal lowered Lake Washington 9 feet in 1916, but not yet here. This is a rare look in 1905 from the university campus across Union Bay to the peninsula which 1 year later in 1906 would be promoted as Laurelhurst, the, quote, most aristocratic section of the city. The peninsula, or part of it, had already been used since 1901 as the first home for the Seattle Golf and Country Club. Across Union Bay from the Laurelhurst promotion, also in 1906, the university's associated students opened their boathouse in response to the then wildly popular canoe and mandolin courting craze. When the lake was lowered, the exposed west shore of Union Bay was used as a city dump, over which the university developed its athletic facilities, including, at the site of the old boathouse, this front lawn to the students' intramural building, wherein the wildly popular contemporary courting craze of bodybuilding is in full flex. What is for many Seattle's greatest institution, the Pike Place Public Market, was created in 1907 as a means of bringing the farmer and the buyer together for a fresh and frugal transaction. Saved from the threat of urban renewal in the late 1960s, the market survives as the city's best living laboratory for a community built on diversity and fresh produce. In 1907, the Jackson Street regrade was started up, and it soon ran a close second to the Denny regrade. Nearly 90 feet of elevation was sluiced from this previously steep Jackson grade east of Fifth Avenue to this gentle incline. One of the few structures saved, the Japanese Baptist Church at the northwest corner of Jackson and Maynard, was lowered by L.B. Gullett, who advertised himself as tried and true in such moving experiences. Now the building's familiar twin gables are supported above floors which were added where once there was hill. In 1909, the regrading of the International District moved a few blocks south to Dearborn Street, where a cut 108 feet deep opened Rainier Valley to the Central Business District. The university's downtown campus on Denny Knoll survived for 12 years after the school moved to its new campus, until 1907, when it was cut through with the 4th Avenue regrade, seen here looking west from University Street. The regrade of the Knoll prepared the site for development of the Metropolitan Tract, the city within a city, as its promoters put it. In 1910, the women of the YWCA, whose temporary quarters at 4th and Seneca were about 30 feet below the pre-regrade site of the old university building, used 4th Avenue as a staging ground for an auto parade promoting their successful fundraising campaign to build their permanent home nearby at 5th and Seneca. In 1924, the Olympic Hotel was built on the old university site. The tract also included the White Henry Stewart building, which has been replaced by the Rainier Tower and the professional Cobb Building on the left with its terracotta adornments, which survive as the last of the Metropolitan Tract's first brick business blocks. When attempts to have the old Territorial University building moved to the new campus failed, the structure was moved a short ways from the regrading juggernaut on 4th and eventually stripped of its columns, which were then moved to the new campus, and where they still stand in the green shade of the university's Sylvan Theater. Other developments in 1907 included the opening of the Dream Theater on First, one of the city's first movie houses. Also, West Seattle, Georgetown, and here Ballard, all of them incorporated communities, gave up their independence in 1907 to become part of Seattle. Since 1976, Ballard Avenue has been one of the city's designated historic districts, and here the ghost of Ballard Pass can be felt especially on quiet Sunday mornings. St. James Cathedral was dedicated in 1907 with one human flaw which announced itself with a crash during the big snow of 1916 when the church's cupola fell to the chancel below, leaving a sanctuary with a decidedly reduced profile. And staying with the snow for a moment, the Queen Anne counterbalance and the rest of the city's transportation was stuck in the blizzard. Green Lake froze over in the week before the February snow, which after the big snow of 1880 is still the deepest in the city's now nearly century-and-a-half history. The now long familiar gasworks opened at the north end of Lake Union in 1907 and continued to manufacture gas there until 1956. 19 years later, in 1975, this industrial temple was saved with the creation of Gasworks Park, a surreal juxtaposition of the grotesque and the picturesque. In 1908, Seattle joined the National Playground Movement and quickly became a leader in the development of supervised play in the city's parks, first here at Collins Playfield. In 1976, the Seattle Buddhist Temple converted the playfield across Main Street from the temple into Wisteria Park. Also in 1908, part of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet visited Elliott Bay. For the parade welcoming the fleet, 2nd Avenue was decked out in patriotic bunting, including this arabesque of flags, emblazoned across the front of Frederick and Nelson's, then still at 2nd and Madison. The city, however, has never been so done up as for the 1909 Alaska, Yukon, and Pacific Exposition, AYP for short, Seattle's first World's Fair built to celebrate the city's success in Alaska and its hopes for continuing that influence along the Pacific Rim. The AYP's Arctic Circle was the fair's elegant face with its domed federal building, looking down the fair's cascades and over its fountain to a Mount Rainier, which in this official rendering has been brought forward to the shores of Lake Washington by a postcard artist. At night, the AYP's White City was illuminated, and generally the Arctic Circle was a sublime environment in which to stroll or relax on the benches that surrounded the fountain, which was later renamed the Drumheller Fountain, now the only part of the fair's Arctic Circle that survives on the UW campus. The AYP's other face was painted and gaudy, its Carnival Avenue or Pay Streak with thrilling rides, exotic restaurants, sensational theaters, and even Aborigines. The Igorots from the Philippines, whose potentially scandalous loincloths were judged anthropologically proper by an especially arranged ethics committee, which included such upright citizens as Judge Thomas Burke on the right, and the lanky progressive Reverend Mark Matthews, whose firebrand sermons filled the pews at First Presbyterian Church. The pay streak extended from Old Meany Hall to Portage Bay, with the railroad bed, which is now the Burke-Gilman Trail, crossing it about midway. The streak's southern half is now crowded with the university's South Campus across Pacific Avenue. Lake Washington Boulevard was completed in 1909 in time for the tourism connected with the AYP. This view of its bridge at Frink Park has received a variety of postcard colorings, and even a retouch that eliminates the motor car's intrusion on this picturesque setting. The most picturesque part of the Lake Washington Boulevard was the Mount Baker curve, including the boathouse and Mount Rainier, which here typically has been retouched in. The ragged line of incision is faintly evident, running conveniently along the mountain's snow line. The Seattle-Everett Interurban was completed to Everett in 1910 and kept making its circuit to and from its Seattle depot on Stewart Street, the present Greyhound Depot, until 1939, when the competition from automobiles and buses shut it down. An itinerant barn burner named Charles Hamilton made the first local heavier-than-air flight in 1910. The exhibition was staged at the Meadows, the local racetrack beside the Duwamish River. Down a runway of planks laid atop the cushion of mud, Hamilton made it aloft and passed above the Meadows Lake before crashing into it, bruised but not seriously injured. 21 years earlier, in 1889, another itinerant flyer, Professor T. Van Tassel, made the first local lighter-than-air flight, riding his balloon aloft from the gas plant on Jackson Street and parachuting back to Earth over Smith Cove. In 1960, William E. Boeing, who by some reports was present at the Meadows the day Hamilton went up and then quickly down again, built the B&W at his factory beside Lake Union. The company soon moved into its Little Red Barn, actually a converted boathouse, on the Duwamish River to manufacture military planes during the First World War. In 1919, Bill Boeing, here on the right, and his co-pilot Eddie Hubbard flew through the snow to Vancouver, British Columbia and back on the first international airmail flight to take off from the United States. The list of famous flights originating in Seattle must include the Navy flyers who began and concluded their 1924 round-the-world flight at Sandpoint. Boeing's contribution to domestic flight was advanced with the first delivery of its Model 80 to Boeing Air Transport in August 1928, only 2 weeks after its first flight. Also in 1928, King County dedicated the airfield it had created out of these farm fields south of Georgetown. Making its commitment to domestic flight, the county named it for their neighbor, Bill Boeing. Boeing Field's administration building was dedicated 2 years later, in 1930. The Boeing Clipper was tested in 1938 on Lake Washington and based at Matthews Beach, just north of Sandpoint. World War II soon halted the model's manufacture, so only 12 Clippers were completed. During the war, Boeing Plant 2 at South Park was covered with a decoy neighborhood, including squatty autos and homes. Below the camouflage, at the peak of production, 16 B-17s, or Flying Fortresses, were produced every 24 hours. After World War II, SeaTac Airport was built by the Port of Seattle to prepare for the passenger jet age, which was propelled forward in 1954 with the first test flight of the Boeing 707. Returning now to 1911, this year King County voters created the Port of Seattle, and in a related public work, construction began on the Lake Washington Ship Canal and its Chittenden locks on Salmon Bay. In another act of radical hydraulics, Green Lake was lowered 7 feet in 1911, thereby beaching this boathouse on the lake's southwest shore, exposing the timber piles that supported West Green Lake Way, and most relevantly exposing new parkland. Now the lake's new girdle of grass and paths separates a graded West Green Lake Way from the lake shore. Green Lake was first developed in the early 1890s. This view looks west across the lake to a Phinney Ridge horizon. The 1893 depression dulled this development until the late 90s, when the city's booming population inevitably pushed north to the lake, especially the east side of it. One part of a 1903 panorama, this scene continues south here. This prospect towards Phinney Ridge is now intersected by the Interstate 5 freeway. Coleman Dock, especially after this handsome version of it was constructed in time for the city's 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, was the principal port for Puget Sound's mosquito fleet of small steamers. On April 25, 1912, as the ocean-going steel-hulled Alameda approached the dock, the ship's captain, Dynamite John O'Brien, commanded the ship's engineer to give a routine full speed astern, and was answered instead with a full speed ahead with these results. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but the dock's clock tower was knocked into the bay. The repaired dock's new tower is seen here in 1913 as the application of the Smith Tower's terracotta skin reaches for its pyramidal cap. Months earlier, the Grand Trunk Pier, one wharf north of the Coleman dock, was photographed from the bay with the Smith Tower steel skeleton behind it. The Smith Tower was dedicated on July 4, 1914. Days later, on July 30th, the Grand Trunk dock was fuel for the city's biggest fire since the Great One of 1889. The city's two fireboats, the Snoqualmie and here the Duwamish, were berthed at Fire Station Number 5 in the slip just north of the Grand Trunk Pier. But neither the fireboats nor the fire station's own barrage of showers could save the pier, which, when it was rebuilt, was finished sans tower. Seattle's newest fireboat, the Chief Seattle, is stationed at the same slip, but the rebuilt Grand Trunk dock has long since been replaced with a parking lot for the Washington State Ferries Terminal, the present incarnation of Coleman Dock. When the last Coleman dock with a tower was sacrificed in the mid-1930s, his tower was this time intentionally dropped in the bay and towed away. The new Art Deco terminal built in its place was designed to complement the Blackball Ferry's new streamlined Kalakala, seen here returning from Bremerton, and here on an excursion through the Chittenden Locks in the late 1940s, which returns us to the Big Snow of 1916 and the first flooding of the canal's Big Lock. That summer, the waters of Lake Washington were lowered 9 feet to the level of Lake Union, and on August 3rd, the Army Corps' launch Orcas and its snag boat, the Swinomish, were the first boats to be lifted through the Big Lock into the new inland freshwater harbor. It was the lock's informal opening. The official opening came nearly 1 year later on July 4th, 1917, when the Roosevelt, Captain Byrd's Arctic explorer, led a flotilla through the Chittenden Locks and down the length of the new canal into Lake Washington. Now, after the Seattle Center, Chittenden Locks are the city's most frequented attraction. The new canal required the construction of bascule bridges at Ballard and Fremont. The flooding of the canal, of course, inundated the dam, which was first built at Lake Union's outlet in 1888 with the founding of the Milltown Fremont. The dam's works doubled as a popular scaffolding for spearing salmon. In 1914, the dam broke, dropping Lake Union by several feet and taking the wooden trestle Fremont Bridge, the predecessor of the bascule, with it. The canal eventually brought the University District its own bascule as well, seen here from the deck during its 1919 dedication. The bridge at Montlake was added in 1925, 5 years after the University of Washington's athletic department began a campaign for a bridge to ease access to the university's new football stadium. Its dedication day, November 27, 1920, is recorded in this panorama. On the field, Dartmouth beat the university 28-7. The Montlake Cut for ships is about 100 yards north of the original log canal and locks which linked Lake Washington and Lake Union first in 1882. Later, the log canal was widened enough to allow through the occasional canoe. Seen here from the north end of Capitol Hill, the old log canal is in line with the present link between I-5 and the Evergreen Point Bridge. The city completed its municipally owned trolley to Ballard in 1918, taking a photo opportunity here on the then-new Ballard-Bascule Bridge. The following year, the city purchased the rest of the community's decaying trolley system at a price it would still have not paid off when the rails were discarded for rubber in 1940. This is the system's north yard at 5th and Mercer during the time of that transition. The locals were ordered to wear masks when the global flu pandemic reached Seattle in the first week of October 1918. The order against public gathering was not lifted or dropped with the masks until Armistice Day, November 11th. Nellie Cornish moved her School of Arts into its new plant on Roy Street in 1921. In 1921, Elliott Avenue still extended north of Mercer Street on a timbered trestle. Turning around and looking south, the trestle turned up West Mercer Place parallel to the trolley tracks. Directly south was Sand Alone, bordered by a string of squatters' shacks. Within 2 years, Elliott Avenue was graded, paved, and connected to the central waterfront. In 1924, Roland Denny, a 2-month-old baby at the 1851 Alki Landing, was flown over Seattle to inspect and no doubt reflect on a city which, like himself, was only 73 years old. In 1925, the University Bookstore moved out of Denny Hall on campus and onto University Avenue, the Ave for short, where it has developed into the largest retailer of general books among the nation's university bookstores. Bertha Landis was elected mayor of Seattle in 1926, the first woman mayor of any major American city. The soul of the university was constructed in 1927 and was later named for the former university president Henry Suzzalo, who was fired by the state's conservative governor Roland Hartley in part for what he described as the library's extravagance. In its original plans, the library included a central tower in the academic Gothic style. Inside this cathedral of books was designed less for books than for looking up for books. The Tudor vault, 73 feet above the reading room's floor, still invites erudite gazing the distance of the big room's 240 feet. The city's skyline was given its uptown anchor in 1928 when the Art Deco Northern Life Tower was opened at 3rd and University. Its 27 stories continued to top off the central business district's north end, later even than this 1956 view of it from First Hill. Then, after the 1968 construction of the Seafirst Tower, a rapid succession of high-rises screened the sky, all of it topped off in 1985 with the out-of-scale 76 floors of the Columbia Center Tower. The addition of the Ice Arena, Civic Field, and Civic Auditorium to the city's cultural life in 1928 continued a tradition of arts and recreation already established at the site of the future World's Fair. This part of David and Louisa Denny's claim was a natural swale where earlier natives held potlatches and strung nets to capture waterfowl flying low between Elliott Bay and the wetlands at the south end of Lake Union. Later, the swale was used as a temporary corral for army mules mobilized during the Spanish-American War. This 1899 view, which looks east over the mules and across the swale towards the Capitol Hill horizon, repeated today is packed with the stuff of Seattle Center. The swale was also a popular staging ground for visiting circuses. This view of it from Queen Anne Hill was photographed in 1896 from very near the same position as this 1930 record of the then nearly new Civic Auditorium, and this contemporary record from the same perspective. The last of the Denny regrades was completed in 1931, the year this aerial was recorded looking north over the central business district and revealing the scar between 5th Avenue and Westlake left by the regrade. Construction began on the Aurora Bridge in 1929. Before the bridge's 2 cantilevers met in June of 1931, the tallest ships, including the Monongahela, that were anchored in the fresh waters of Lake Union, were towed out. Others with lower masts stayed. The Lake Union fleets were not limited to sailing ships, but included lines of wooden freighters built for but never used in World War I, and the crews of University of Washington, who used the lakes for training. The Aurora Bridge was dedicated on February 22, 1932. It was the city's most imposing link in the new Pacific Coast Highway, which was also cut through Woodland Park, an act which understandably inspired a storm of protest from all sides, but which proceeded nonetheless. The new Aurora Thruway paralleled the old trolley right-of-way through Woodland Park, which since the early 1890s had been a popular sightseer's excursion. Woodland Park's Auto Camp, which was opened in 1921 for the new summer culture of sightseeing car tourists, was closed by the city in 1929, describing it as a, quote, bedroom for freeloading gas car gypsies. South of the bridge, Aurora was widened into a speedway. Here at Broad Street, Aurora is sided by 2 rows of power poles. The row on the right at the street's new and widened curb, and the row on the left, soon to be removed at the curb of the old, narrow neighborhood street. Broad and Mercer Streets were major obstructions to the limited access on Aurora Speedway and were both tunneled below Highway 99 in the late 1950s. Bread lines and soup kitchens and political rallies and squatters' shacks were regular features of the 1930s in Seattle as everywhere. And strikes like that by maritime workers in 1934, here obstructing the loading of the Alaska Steamship Company's liner Victoria at Pier 2. In 1931, the Unemployed Citizens League founded what it called the Republic of the Penniless. At its peak, the League involved 50,000 members in Seattle alone, and its barter economy spread throughout the state, encouraging exchanges of services and goods between town and country. And here we return, not to the present, but to where we began this chronology with this poetic postcard, which enclosed within the letters spelling Seattle the city's principal symbols at the dawn of World War II. The postcard's 2 towers, the Smith and the totem, have survived, although the original stolen totem, dedicated in Pioneer Square in 1899, was disfigured by fire and replaced by this convincing copy. Chittenden Locks, Snoqualmie Falls, the lake, and beyond it the mountain all endure as community symbols. Perhaps only the Aurora Bridge, although it too survives, has slipped from this pantheon. One of these touchstones of community pride has perished, however, the Mercer Island Bridge, which sank during the Thanksgiving storm of 1990. When it was new, the bridge opened up the east side with a speed and ease the old Lake Washington ferries like the Leschi could not hope to match. Construction of the floating bridge began in 1939, the year that Roland Denny, the last of the original settlers, died at the age of 88. Here on the right, an old Roland sits beside the Territorial University's columns with another pioneer, University history professor Edward Meany. Now Roland lies with the rest of Arthur and Mary Denny's family at Lakeview Cemetery. The Denny's impressive plot looks across to the vault of another university history professor, the recently deceased Giovanni Costigan. In 1853, during the second year of settlement, the Republican Arthur Denny and the Democrat David Doc Maynard made the city's first grids. Maynard below Yesler Way and Denny above it. When they couldn't agree where the streets should meet, the streets didn't meet. Later, Denny explained that this lack of uniformity in the city's first grid was the result of Maynard's appetite for spirits. In other words, that the doctor was drunk. While Arthur Denny might have been right in his diagnosis of Maynard's capacities that day, he was wrong in the conclusion that Maynard's inclinations were out of line with Seattle's. There are few cities with a topography as spirited as Seattle's. Built on 37 hills, its setting is so powerfully diverse, so powerfully drunk, that even a history of grids, regrades, and even Republicans could not smooth or straighten the imagination of this place. Now David and Catherine Maynard are buried at Lakeview's highest point, a stone's throw from Arthur and Mary Denny's statuary. The Maynard's plaques are hardly legible. They lie flat at the foot of the Maynard tree, where their bones no doubt are by now thoroughly entwined with the tree's roots, as much as with Seattle's.